The UK has become a third world country while Poland has taken its place as a first world country, which is hilarious when you consider one of the reasons for Brexit in 2016 was that people were unhappy with the amount of immigrants from Eastern Europe, including of course Poland. But now all the Polish people are going back to Poland while the UK collapses and saying, I don't want to live in the UK anymore. Talk about a crazy turn of events in the last decade for the UK. But let's talk about how this actually happened and what it means for your portfolio, because no matter where you are in the world, the UK collapsing will impact your portfolio. So on Friday, Poland's stock market closed at an all-time high of 142,000 points on the WIG, the WIG. This is the Polish version of the S&P 500. And also, by the way, it's up 35% in the last year. Now that same week in Britain, the man most likely to become the next Prime Minister, Nigel Farage, quit Parliament due to a massive scandal, which we'll talk about the details of that scandal in a second. And now he's fighting an election against a rubbish bin. I mean, I wish I was joking, but there's this comedian called Count Binface. He wears an actual bin on his head. And right now, he's the main opposition in the by-election that decides Nigel Farage's career. And this is just a few weeks after 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝘀, the current Prime Minister of the UK, resigned, making 6 Prime Ministers in about 7 or 8 years for the UK. That's the United Kingdom in 2026. And when you look at the actual numbers, it stops being funny and it just gets kind of sad. So today we're covering 3 things. First, how Britain is speed running their collapse. Second, how Poland is speed running in the opposite direction. And what I'm doing with my own money that I previously had invested in the UK. In case you don't know me, my name's Nick. I've been a professional investor and unprofessional trader for 25 years, and I lived in the UK from 2009 until very recently. So I've seen the UK's downfall firsthand. Now, technically speaking, the UK has been falling apart since around about 2008 because it never properly recovered from the global financial crisis. But in the last few months, we've seen a real acceleration of that collapse. One of the highlights of the last month was 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝘀 resigning less than 2 years after winning in an absolute landslide. This is because his party, Labour, got absolutely hammered in the May Council elections and nearly 100 Labour MPs publicly called for him to go. Think of the council elections as mini elections to decide the leaders of local councils, but not the actual Prime Minister. So Labour under 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝘀 had been doing such a bad job that Labour got absolutely decimated in the council elections and 𝗧𝗶𝗺 was forced to resign as a result. He's staying on as caretaker for just a little while Labour runs a popularity contest to pick his replacement, which should be done by about September. That means that Britain is now on its 6th Prime Minister in around about 7 years. And notice who picks the new Prime Minister. It's not done by a vote. The Labour Party just picks a guy. So Britain gets yet another Prime Minister that not a single member of the public voted for, which is just absurd. The favourite to take over right now is called Andy Burnham. He's the mayor of Greater Manchester, but his economic policies are not liked by everyone. JP Morgan, for example, is reportedly considering scrapping $1 billion UK investment if Andy Burnham gets to the job. And while the governing party picks some random guy that nobody ever voted for, look at what the opposition's doing. So you got Nigel Farage. He's led national polls for most of this year. The bookies have him as the next Prime Minister of the UK, but he's not in the Labour Party, so he can only become Prime Minister with a general election, which could still be a few years away. Now, Farage is the leader of the Reform Party, and he's the MP for a part of the UK called Clacton. But on July 7th, he announced that he's resigning from that position over allegations that he failed to declare millions of pounds in gifts from wealthy donors, allegedly. So he denies any wrongdoing in this. Of course he does. I mean, that's what politicians do, right? Now look, I'm not going to get into my political opinion here on who I think should take over as the next Prime Minister. That's not what this video is about, and that's on you to decide if you're a UK citizen. I'm just here to point out the facts, and I find it very funny that Farage got up on stage and took the piss out of 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝘀 for some rather large campaign donations that 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀 got, specifically around a very expensive set of glasses that 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀 was donated and was wearing. Yeah, actual glasses. I know it's very weird. Editor, roll the clip, please.
Do you like them? Very expensive. But guess what? I bought them myself. How about that?
So obviously, after taking the piss out of 𝗧𝗺𝗺 for a few £100,000 in donations, when it came out that Farage had £5 million in donations, it didn't look too good for him. And of course, he's been getting a little flack in the media, or a lot of flack. So his answer was to resign, which triggers a by-election for his own seat. Now, his plan was to simply run again and be re-elected for the same seat that he just resigned from. This proves that the people actually want him as MP. Basically, it's a trial in the public court of opinion for this little snafu with the £5 million in donations. Some would call it a publicity stunt. And recognizing it as such, as a publicity stunt, the other parties, Labour, Lib Dems, the Tories, etc., looked at this as a joke of an election and said, nah, we're going to sit this one out. You have your fun, Nigel. But one guy didn't sit it out. Count Binface. As I said earlier, Count Binface is a comedian with a bin on his head, whose manifesto includes forcing rule-breaking cyclists to ride unicycles. People in the UK hate cyclists. And whose campaign slogan is taking out the trash, of course referring to Nigel Farage as the trash. I mean, I need to stop laughing at this stuff because while it's funny, it's also just sad to watch that this is what the once mighty UK has fallen to. I mean, politics is always a bit of a joke in every country because we know how dodgy politicians are and how a lot of this stuff is just rigged. But when it gets to this level of joke, it's a sign that the country is in a downfall. But it's also just one of the signs. Let's go through each of the signs. So the first thing to usually go wrong is the economics. And we're going to talk about the UK economics. Back in May, I made a video saying that the UK was 5 months away from a crisis moment. And I said that because every collapsing country follows roughly the same path. First, the bond market loses patience, then skilled people who live in the country just leave, then the infrastructure breaks, and then the currency gets debased, and the political system blows up. So most countries take decades to go through this, but Britain is doing it in fast forward. It's speed running its collapse. 2 months after my video on this subject, here's the scorecard. This is what it looks like. First, the bond market. The 30-year gilt is at 5.63% this week. A gilt is simply what the UK calls treasury bonds. So it's the UK version of the US treasury bond. So the 30-year gilt peaked at 5.82% in May. That was the highest since 1998, by the way, and has barely come down since. And the debt that 5.63% yield applies to is currently sat at 2.9 trillion. That's the UK debt, 2.9 trillion pounds, which is 95% of GDP, by the way. So the interest on that debt is 110 billion pounds a year alone. That's just the interest repayments. And that's about what the UK spends on education. So the interest repayments are equal to the education budget. And that just goes straight to bondholders to pay off interest. So it's fair to say that the UK is in a bit of trouble, economically speaking. Then this month, the government's own watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, published its fiscal risk report. And their numbers are scarier than mine were in my last video on this subject. Which, by the way, I got criticized for my numbers saying that I was being alarmist. Then the official reports come out and they're way worse than my numbers. So it turns out I wasn't really being alarmist enough. On its current path, over the next decade, UK debt heads towards 300% of GDP. It's 95% right now, remember? The state pension bill nearly doubles as a share of the economy, and the tax burden hits 43% of GDP by 2030, the highest in modern British history. And what about growth? The IMF just cut the UK's 2026 forecast from 1.3% to 0.8%. That is a crazy low number for GDP growth. And there's no recession to blame it on either, by the way. It's actually worse than a recession because a recession just happens, and for the most part, it just kind of ends and things get back on track. What's happening in the UK is like being stuck in the mud. It is moving, but it's just moving at a very slow pace, depleting more and more energy as it goes, and the mud is never ending. And the people who can leave are leaving. Over 250,000 British citizens left in a single year, which is frankly a staggering number because a lot of these are young, talented minds, but they're going away to grow some other country's future. Oh, and the debasement of the pound. £100 from the year 2000 buys you about £55 worth of stuff today. The pound has lost nearly half of its value this century in the last 26 years. Real wages in Britain, by the way, have gone nowhere since 2008. That hasn't happened for over a 200-year stretch of British economic history. It's just insane to think that on average, wages have not gone up for 20 years, while inflation has eaten away almost 50% of spending power. And of course, the official numbers say that inflation's back around target, but we all know that the official numbers are nonsense. Which brings us to the date that actually worries me for the UK. The UK budget, which is coming in either October or November. And keep in mind that the new Prime Minister will only have been on the job for a few months before he has to write the entire budget for a country who's paying 110 billion in interest on its debt. That's the crisis window that I flagged in May when I did a video on this. And we're inside that window now. Now, some of you will push back and say, Nick, the FTSE 100 is at 10,500, near record highs, collapse is cancelled, right? In case you don't know, by the way, the FTSE is the UK version of the S&P 500. And I understand that point. The FTSE is near record highs, but I'll counter with 2 points of my own. First, the companies listed on the FTSE index make most of their money abroad, not within the UK. So a record FTSE doesn't say much about the economic health of the UK itself. And get this part too, over 60% of takeover bids for UK listed companies now come from overseas. Foreign buyers are picking up good British companies cheap because the country is just not doing too well. Second, the FTSE is up about 5% this year. People seem to think it's a good year, but the WIG, which is, like I said earlier, the Polish version of the S&P 500 and the Polish version of the FTSE, is up about 15%, which is 3 times as much. And over the last 12 months, the difference is even crazier, with the FTSE being up over 16% versus the WIG almost 40%. So talking about Poland, let's dive into Poland a little bit more, because it's like a mirror image of the UK right now. And I think one detail sums this thing up better than anything. Poland used to store its gold in London, but in 2019 they flew it home. 8 covert night flights out of the UK, 100 tons of bullion, police escorts, helicopters, the whole lot. And I think that's a perfect metaphor for the state of the UK right now. Even countries that they once looked down upon don't trust them to store their gold anymore. And since those flights, Poland's central bank has been the most aggressive gold buyer on the planet. They were the biggest single central bank buyer in both 2024 and 2025. Poland holds 582 tons of gold as of this spring. That's more gold than the European Central Bank. In January, they formally adopted a target of 700 tons, which puts them in the top 10 on Earth. So this is a country that had 14 tons in 1996, and now they're one of the top 10, or about to be one of the top 10 on Earth. So why does a central bank do that? Well, they've watched the West freeze $300 billion of Russian reserves in 2022, and they drew the obvious conclusion. If your money sits in someone else's system, it's not really your money. And look, I don't love central banks, but you got to respect the trade that Poland's been taking. And they're doing exactly what metal guys like me get laughed at for doing, except they're doing it with like 582 tons of it, which I wish I had 582 tons. And the stock market is even crazier. The WIG, Poland's main index, and yeah, it's really called the WIG. I love saying that name, by the way, the WIG, it's crazy. Anyway, it crossed 100,000 points in April of 2025 for the first time in its history. And on Friday, it closed at 142,000 points, like I said earlier. That's a 42% move in just over a year, like 15 months. All-time high after all-time high, and the crazy part is it's still technically cheap. I mean, the Polish market trades at a price-to-earnings ratio of about 12. The S&P 500 trades at a price-to-earnings ratio of about 25. So a quick plain English explanation of what PE is, or price-to-earnings ratio. That's what you pay for $1 of yearly company profit. In Warsaw, you pay $12 for $1 of yearly company profit. In New York, you pay $25 for that same $1. So even after a 35% run, you're paying half as much for each unit of profit in Poland as you are in the US. Cheap and rising at the same time, and you don't really see that combination too often. That's why I invested in Poland towards the start of this year. Now, picture a fund manager in London deciding where pension money sits for the next decade. Option 1, lend to the British government at 5.6% with a 6th Prime Minister incoming, budget chaos in October. Option 2, profitable Polish banks at 12 times earning. It's in an economy growing at 3.5% per year. Nothing personal about it, it's just maths. They're going to go for Poland, obviously. So multiply that one decision by every allocator on the planet, and you get 2 charts on your screen, and one chart goes down, the other one goes up. And by the way, you know how I said Poland is expected to grow at 3.5% in 2026? Well, remember, the UK's projections are 0.8%. So Poland is growing 4 times faster than the country that used to employ its plumbers. That's the bit that people forget. After 2004, over 1 million Poles moved to Britain for work. Now that flow has completely reversed. Polish people and European people in general are leaving the UK. Poles are going home because their wages converge and their country just works a lot better now, and they're taking all their skills with them. Defense is also pouring petrol on the growth. Poland spends 4.7% of its GDP on its its military, the highest share in NATO, higher than the US, by the way, as a percentage of GDP. So they're doubling their army from 150,000 to 300,000 personnel. A huge chunk of that money lands in Polish factories and Polish wages. And here are some more crazy facts about Poland, by the way. 12 of Poland's 17 regions are now richer than Wales. Lower Silesia is a region of Poland, has overtaken Greater Manchester. And Warsaw's metro area produces around 67,000 euro per head in economic output, second in the entire EU behind only central London, which is insane. 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝘀 himself, back before he was Prime Minister, warned that Poland would be richer than Britain per person by 2030 if the trend continued. Now, the forecasters at the 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀 are more conservative. They say that Poland passes Britain on wealth by person by about 2035. So the argument isn't really if it happens. The average Pole is going to overtake the average Brit. It's whether that happens in 4 years or 9 years, probably somewhere in between. Let's be serious. Now, let me be straight with you though, because the title of this video is a bit controversial, let's say. The UK is not literally a third world country. Wages are still higher than Poland, technically speaking, but the point is where Britain is heading and how fast. Bond premiums, brain drain, broken infrastructure, a debased currency, revolving door politics, to be honest, a clown show of politics. Britain is ticking every box on the checklist of a collapsing country. Poland spent the last decade doing the exact opposite, and Poland is no utopia either, by the way. I'm not going to pretend that Poland is the perfect country, because it isn't. Their deficit is around 7% of GDP, the second biggest in Europe, and Brussels has them on the naughty list for that. And they have EU money turbocharging their growth, but that's going to be cut off as of the end of 2026. And the market's already up 35% in a year, so a lot of this story about Poland has been priced in. You might have missed the trade if you're getting in today. Then there's the other obvious one. Poland has a live war sitting on its border. If that war escalates, Polish assets get hit first and hardest, and no PE ratio protects you from geography. Part of the reason the market is that cheap is because you're being paid to hold exposure next to a war zone. So know that going in about Poland. It's not like a perfect trade, not by any means. So what am I doing about all this? Look, the simple answer would be me saying go and buy the wig or just throw money into Poland in some way, shape or form, but it's not really that simple. So if you got money invested in the UK in some roundabout way, you probably want to talk to your financial advisor about diversification. Doesn't matter what country you're in, you might have some UK exposure. But to me, this whole debate about Poland is bigger than just the UK versus Poland. Warsaw's index is built up of old school economy, banks, energy, copper, and consumer staples. So a lot of the reasons I diversified into Poland is to just get out of the AI trade. I wanted somewhere outside of the US to park my money, and Poland was one of the best places. Now, Poland still looks good to me, but like I said, talk to your financial advisor and figure out if it works for you.